an expert witness in the area of governmental use of media for disinformation and propaganda.
Yes, I have. I've testified as an expert in that field in both state and federal courts in this country. I've testified in foreign courts. I testified once before the United Nations on that subject and once before the U.S. Congress.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to show you a copy of your own CD. It's a summary of your professional publication. I want you to confirm its accuracy.
Yes, that's my CD that I prepared.
Your Honor, we move the admission of Mr. Schaaf's CV and move that he be accepted as an expert witness in the matter at hand for the issues of government use of media for disinformation and propaganda purposes.
Okay.
In the course of your research, have you had occasion to study the use of the media by government agencies?
Yes, I have. I've studied many government reports on the subject. Many books have been written about it, articles, and in fact, I've written many of those articles.
Can you give the court and the jury a brief summary of the subject, indicating the extent to which this type of activity by government still takes place?
Yes, I can. I won't go into ancient history, but it should be noted that governments around the world have secretly used the media for their purposes for many hundreds of years, probably thousands, but certainly from the 16th and 17th century in England on, there's been a great deal of research about the use by governments, the secret use of the media. For our purposes, though, particularly relating to the U.S., the most significant and the first major deliberate program in this country was during World War I, when President Wilson set up an organization called the Committee for Public Information under a public relations executive man named George Creel. The purpose of this committee was to propagandize the war effort against Germany. This was created immediately after the U.S. entered World War I in 1917. And in propagandizing the war effort and war news, it was the policy of this committee to have no compunctions about falsifying the news whenever it was felt that that was necessary to help the war effort.
Can you give us an example of the type of falsification of the news that you're talking about?
Yes, the Committee for Public Information purported very often to release documents, supposedly genuine documents, to the press in order to substantiate whatever particular position the Wilson government might have been taking at the time. And one of the most famous that happened early in its creation in 1917 was a disinformation campaign to suggest that the Russian revolutionaries, Lenin in particular and Trotsky, were actually German agents being paid by the Kaiser. The government and Creel's committee made up the story. They created phony documents. They passed it all to friends in the major newspapers, and almost immediately this was front page news around the United States and around the world.
I'm going to show you a New York Times headline, that era, and see if that's the kind of falsification you're talking about.
Yes, this is, the rest of the text is from an article where that headline appeared, but that was on the front page of the New York Times in 1917. And later it transpired that the documents were forgeries that had been created by Mr. Creel. And of course, as was obvious by the current course of history, the Russian revolutionaries were hardly friends of the Kaiser,
yes,
much less employees.
Can you continue with your summary?
Yes, after World War I, U.S. continued to be or actually became the world's leader in the control of information. Britain had been more preeminent before World War I, but at the end of the war, the U.S. was really in control of all the world communication media. And disinformation was used by the government sporadically during the interwar years. It was particularly used in the Red Scares of the 1920s and the creation of disinformation suggesting various opponents of the government were communists. But it wasn't a major aspect of government policy until the advent of World War II. And that was when deliberate disinformation or a structure for emitting deliberate disinformation became very, very important.
What happened at that point in history to bring about that resurgence?
Well, at the very beginning of World War II, there were really two schools of thought competing, both of which had government agencies. One that was set up was called the Office of War Information, which was a civilian organization, although worked closely with the War Department, as it was then called. And it was headed by a man named Elmer Davis, who was a very famous reporter, a journalist. His philosophy was that the agencies should tell the American people exactly what was happening, tell them the truth. If we lost a battle somewhere in Europe or in the Pacific, we should tell the people we lost that battle. If we won a battle, we tell them we won it. But he believed that in the long run, we would do best by reporting the truth. But at the same time, another key organization that developed during World War II was the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was headed by a military man, William Donovan, who was known as Wild Bill Donovan, who believed the same that George Creel had his philosophy from World War I, which was that you should lie to the people whenever it's necessary, whenever you think lying will help maintain morale and win the war. This struggle was taking place, of course, in the context of World War II, and Donovan won, both with President Roosevelt and after with President Truman. His philosophy that disinformation was a powerful, a valuable weapon for a country to have, and that the disadvantages of lying to the American people were outweighed by the advantages of being able to manipulate the media. So when the war was over, the Office of War Information was dissolved, the OSS was transformed into the CIA, and the CIA was now existing in peacetime, mind you. World War II was over, and now the CIA is set up with disinformation as a major part of its work, and in fact, as most of the reports later pointed out, the largest single part of the CIA's operations. Within the government, at least, the acceptability of lying to the public became very widespread and acceptable even in time of peace. There had been people who felt, well, it's one thing when you're at war, but even in time of peace, it became acceptable, and it spread from other agencies, including the FBI, which also began to engage in media manipulation in a very, very large way.
So, in addition to being a wartime strategy, with respect to the security of the nation and the propagation of falsehoods in times of war, this tactic started to be used in peacetime.
Exactly. That was the major difference. Certain things were much more acceptable or expected over the course of history in time of war, and were generally supposed to stop